On July 3rd, Russia's defense ministry told President Vladimir Putin that its forces had taken full control of Kostiantynivka, a city in eastern Ukraine's Donetsk region, after a battle that had ground on for roughly 9 months. The next day, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky posted a flat denial. Ukrainian forces, he said, still control the city. He called the Russian claim a lie, manufactured to generate a headline, and then he added something sharper. If Kostiantynivka were really under Russian control, he said, Putin would have no problem meeting him there to negotiate an end to the war. Ukraine's general staff backed him up, saying its units were still conducting defensive operations inside the town and along its approaches. Reuters, reporting on both claims, said it could not independently verify either version of events. So what actually happened in Kostiantynivka this weekend remains genuinely unresolved, and I want to be upfront about that, rather than pretend otherwise. But I don't think the most important question here is who's telling the truth about one town. I think the more revealing question is why Russia would reach for this specific claim at this specific moment, and what the answer tells you about a war that increasingly runs on two completely different sets of numbers, depending on who's counting. Let's start with why Kostiantynivka matters enough for either side to fight over the narrative this hard. The city sits inside what's often called Ukraine's fortress belt, a chain of heavily fortified cities running through the Donetsk region that forms the backbone of Ukraine's entire eastern defense. Kostiantynivka is the southernmost anchor of that belt, sitting alongside Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, as the three cities most analysts consider the last serious obstacle standing between Russian forces and full control of the region. Taking it, if it's actually been taken, would represent one of Russia's most significant territorial gains in this stretch of the war, a genuine strategic prize rather than a minor village. That's precisely why the claim carries so much weight either way. If true, it's a real turning point, one that would put Russian forces within artillery range of the next line of defended cities. If false or exaggerated, it's a particularly valuable piece of propaganda because everyone already knows how much this specific city would matter if it fell. And there's a pattern worth noticing in how this claim arrived. According to Russia's own defense ministry statements over the following 2 days, its forces also took 5 additional villages, several in the Kharkiv region, one more in Donetsk. Small, incremental, largely unverifiable gains, announced in the same rhythm, the same daily briefing format that's been used throughout this war. A single unverified claim about a minor village is easy to overlook. A single unverified claim about the anchor of Ukraine's entire defensive line is not. Stacking the two types of announcements together on the same weekend is itself a kind of narrative construction, regardless of what's actually happening on the ground. Here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, because whether or not Kostiantynivka has fallen, there's a set of numbers behind this war that neither side disputes nearly as much, and those numbers tell a very different story than a single captured city would suggest. The Institute for the Study of War, a Washington-based research organization that tracks this conflict using geolocated, open-source footage rather than either government's official claims, has been measuring Russia's actual territorial gains throughout 2026. Their finding is stark. In the first 6 months of this year, Russia's net territorial gain across the entire front amounts to roughly 97 square kilometers. To put that in perspective, that's a smaller area than many mid-sized cities. At that pace, completing the stated goal, the remaining 20% of Donetsk that Russia doesn't yet control would take approximately 14 more years. And that's after Kiev says Russia has already missed 14 previous deadlines it set for itself to complete this same objective. 14 years to finish a war Russia has already been fighting in this specific region for 12. That's not a rounding error in a military campaign. That's a mathematical signal that the current strategy, however many headlines it generates, isn't actually working at anything close to the scale its architects intended. It's worth putting that 14-year projection inside the full arc of this war, because the number only really lands once you see the scale it's being measured against. Russia's full invasion began in February of 2022. Since then, Ukraine has received roughly $188 billion in aid from the United States and close to another $200 billion from the European Union, and Russia still controls only about a fifth of Ukrainian territory. Zelensky, referencing figures from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, has put Russia's total casualties since the war began at somewhere around 1.4 million people. Set against that backdrop, the idea that Moscow now needs another 14 years, on top of the 12 it's already spent fighting specifically for Donetsk, to finish a single regional objective isn't a footnote. It's a measure of just how far this campaign has drifted from whatever timeline its planners originally imagined. And the cost side of that equation is even more telling. Ukraine's military estimates Russia suffered close to 40,000 casualties in June alone, a monthly rate that, according to Kyiv, significantly outpaces Russia's own capacity to recruit and train new soldiers. The Institute for the Study of War calculated what that means per square kilometer of ground actually taken. In June of 2025, Russia was losing roughly 68 soldiers for every square kilometer it captured. 1 year later, in June of 2026, that number had climbed to nearly 1,300 casualties per square kilometer. That's not a war grinding forward at a steady, if brutal, pace. That's a war where the price of each additional meter of ground has climbed by a factor of almost 20 in a single year. I want to sit with that number for a moment because I think it's the actual story, hiding underneath the dispute over one city. When a military campaign's cost per unit of territory rises that sharply, year over year, it usually means one of two things is happening. Either the defender has found a way to make each subsequent position dramatically harder to take than the last, or the attacker has run out of the kind of maneuver warfare that captures ground efficiently and is left grinding forward through sheer attrition, trading soldiers for meters, because there's no faster option left on the table. Based on the available evidence, both appear to be true at once. Ukraine has spent years building layered defensive lines specifically through cities like Kostiantynivka. And Russia's own president has been fairly direct in a recent interview with a state media reporter about why he's rejected two separate ceasefire proposals from Kyiv this year, one covering long-range strikes, another covering the northern and southern flanks of the front. His stated reasoning was that Russia's own strikes deep into Ukrainian territory are, in his words, more powerful and more destructive than anything Ukraine can currently answer with. Whether or not that's an accurate military assessment, it tells you Moscow currently sees more strategic value in continuing to escalate than in freezing the conflict where it currently stands, even as the attrition math on the ground grows steadily less favorable. Which brings us to the other half of this weekend's news, because while the Kostiantynivka claim was dominating headlines, Ukraine was busy demonstrating exactly the kind of asymmetric response that's been reshaping this war's second half. Ukrainian long-range drones struck the St. Petersburg region overnight, roughly 900 kilometers from any Ukrainian-held territory, hitting an oil terminal and a naval facility at the Kronstadt base. Regional officials said air defenses shot down 72 drones over the area, which on its own tells you the scale of the attack Ukraine was actually attempting. This wasn't an isolated strike either. Russian oil infrastructure across multiple regions has been absorbing repeated Ukrainian drone attacks throughout this year, disrupting refining capacity badly enough that residents in Crimea have reportedly faced fuel rationing following some of the more recent overnight strikes. Here's why this matters for understanding the overall shape of the war, rather than as an isolated news item. This wave was part of a broader pattern of long-range Ukrainian strikes reportedly using a newer weapon system, sometimes referred to by the codename Flamingo, capable of reaching deep into Russian territory. One of those strikes reportedly hit a plant in Udmurtia, more than 1,400 kilometers from Ukraine, involved in producing several of Russia's missile systems, a facility that had already been struck once before earlier this year. Separately, Russian oil producer Rosneft was forced to halt processing at one of its refineries following another drone attack, and residents in Crimea have reportedly faced fuel rationing following a string of these overnight strikes on energy and military infrastructure. The European Union, for its part, has proposed a 21st package of sanctions, specifically targeting Russian banks, crypto networks used to move money around existing restrictions, and the supply chains behind Russian drone production. Put together, Russia is grinding forward on the ground at enormous and rising human cost, capturing territory measured in tens of square kilometers over 6 months. Ukraine, meanwhile, has shifted a significant portion of its own strategic effort away from trying to match that on the ground, where it's heavily outnumbered, and toward degrading the economic and industrial infrastructure that funds Russia's ability to keep fighting at all. Neither approach looks like it's forcing a decisive resolution on its own, but they are two very different theories of how you eventually win a war of this shape. One betting that enough territory eventually breaks the other side's will, the other betting that enough economic and industrial pressure eventually breaks the other side's capacity, regardless of how much territory it's holding when that happens. All of this is unfolding just days before NATO leaders are set to gather in Ankara for a summit where members are expected to pledge around $80 billion in additional military assistance to Ukraine for this year alone. That timing isn't incidental. A dramatic, headline-grabbing territorial claim, verified or not, lands very differently in the middle of a week when Western governments are deciding how much further to commit to funding the other side. Whether or not Kostiantynivka has genuinely fallen, the claim itself functions as an argument aimed at that specific audience, at that specific moment. So where does this actually leave the question I started with? I don't think we can say with confidence tonight whether Kostiantynivka is under Russian control, under Ukrainian control, or genuinely contested between the two, and I'd treat any confident claim in either direction from either government with real skepticism until independent verification catches up. What I think we can say with much more confidence is this: whichever way that specific dispute resolves, it doesn't meaningfully change the underlying arithmetic that the Institute for the Study of War has been tracking all year. A war advancing at 97 square kilometers over 6 months, at a casualty cost climbing toward 1,300 lives per square kilometer, is not a war being won in any conventional sense of that word, regardless of which flag gets raised over any single town this weekend. The framework worth carrying forward from this story is a simple one, but it's easy to lose sight of in the noise of daily battlefield claims. A single captured city makes for a powerful headline. It rarely tells you, on its own, whether the underlying campaign that produced it is actually sustainable. The more reliable signal almost always sits one layer beneath the headline, in the trend line of cost against gain over months and years, not in the disputed status of any individual town on any individual weekend. This applies well beyond this particular war too. Anytime you see a single dramatic claim of victory or defeat in an ongoing conflict, the useful question isn't whether the claim is true in isolation. It's what the claim is being used to distract from or argue toward at that exact moment. A captured city announced right before a funding summit is doing rhetorical work regardless of its accuracy. A disputed denial delivered with a pointed challenge to negotiate is doing rhetorical work too. Both statements are optimized for an audience watching from outside the country, not purely for the soldiers actually holding the ground in dispute. Russia may well control Kostiantynivka by the time you're watching this. It may not. Either way, the number that should actually worry Moscow's planners isn't the name of one city. It's the shape of a curve that's been bending sharply in the wrong direction for a year, with no sign yet of bending back.